It was a Tuesday morning in Boston, and I was in my small kitchen, the one with peeling linoleum and a leaky faucet, pouring myself a cup of coffee that smelled stronger than my nerves, when the phone rang and the caller ID flashed the name of my son, Michael. My heart jumped with that same blend of excitement and dread only a mother knows, because Michael never called without wanting something, but this morning was supposed to be different. We had been planning this trip for months. It was going to be his delayed honeymoon with Ashley, his wife of 2 years, and I had begged, insisted, really, that I come along because I wanted to share in their happiness, to be a part of their joy, to finally create memories, instead of just watching my life tick away alone. I had spent nearly every penny of my retirement savings on those tickets to the Bahamas, a 5-star resort Ashley had picked after scrolling through Instagram for days, showing me picture after picture with that bright smile of hers that I thought was genuine when she said, "Helen, this one's perfect. You'll love it. It'll be amazing to be there together." I even splurged on a brand new dress from Macy's, the kind I never would have let myself buy when I was younger because it cost nearly half my monthly Social Security check. But I thought, this is special. This is a once-in-a-lifetime trip with my son and his wife, and I wanted to look beautiful, even if I was 72 and my hair was more silver than brown. My suitcase had been packed for 3 days, sitting by the front door like a dog waiting to be let outside, and every time I looked at it, my stomach fluttered with the nervous excitement of a woman about to step into an adventure. So when I answered and said in my sweetest motherly voice, "What time are we heading to the airport, son?" I wasn't prepared for the silence that sliced through me like a blade of ice. At first I thought the connection had dropped, but then I heard him laugh. A laugh I didn't recognize, a laugh that made me feel small before I even understood why. "Airport?" he said, his voice tinged with disbelief, as if my question was absurd. "Mom, we're already here. We flew out yesterday. Didn't Ashley tell you?" I nearly dropped the phone. For a moment, I thought my hearing had betrayed me, but then in the background, I heard the unmistakable sound of ocean waves, people laughing, glasses clinking, the easy music of a steel drum band playing near the water. They were there, in paradise, without me. And then Ashley's voice, faint but sharp, carried through the line. "Just the closest family, Michael." Closest family? Me, the woman who had carried him in my arms through fevers, who had worked double shifts at the diner and then at the textile plant just to put him through college, who had pawned my mother's wedding ring to help with the down payment on their condo, was not close enough to be included in the very vacation I had funded? My reflection in the kitchen window glared back at me. An old woman in a faded housecoat with her gray hair twisted in a messy bun, eyes that had once shined with pride, now empty with betrayal. "Was this a mistake?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "Did you forget to tell me?" And then Ashley took the phone, her tone dripping with condescension like she was talking to a child who didn't understand the rules of the playground. "Oh, Helen, don't take it so personally. We just wanted to relax, no stress. You know you don't handle hotels well anyway. Remember how you complained about the air conditioning last summer in Cape Cod?" I stood there, staring at my suitcase, the new dress, the plane tickets that had been a dream, realizing I had been treated like an old piece of furniture, useful when needed, ignored when not. For 3 years, I had been wiring money to Michael every time he called with another emergency. The condo deposit, the furniture, Ashley's credit card bills, the new car, and now this vacation. 3 years, more than $3 million. Every dime I had scraped together in a lifetime of sacrifice. I had canceled my private health insurance, sold the few pieces of jewelry that still connected me to my parents, and given up on fixing the leaking roof above my head just so they could live in comfort. And yet here I was, excluded, invisible, discarded like an unwanted guest. Rage surged through me, not just about the money, but the humiliation, the realization that I had become nothing more than an ATM with a heart, a resource to be drained but never respected. That night, While raindrops from my leaking roof tapped like mocking fingers above my bed, I scrolled through Instagram and saw Ashley posting beach photos in her bikini, sipping cocktails I had unknowingly bought her, her caption reading, "Paradise with my love and the people who matter most." My heart cracked, but under the heartbreak, a strange, cold clarity began to form. I didn't sleep. Instead, I stared at the ceiling, the moonlight wash across my room, and thought of every sacrifice, every lie, every time I chose to starve myself of comfort so they could thrive. And by dawn, I knew. Tomorrow, I would walk into the bank. But this time, it wouldn't be to send money. It would be to reclaim what little dignity I had left. That night, I lay awake, staring at the cracks in my bedroom ceiling, listening to the steady drip from the leak in the corner that I had ignored for months, because every time I thought about calling a repairman, Michael would show up with another emergency that needed my money more than my roof did. But now, as the drip echoed through my tiny apartment, it didn't sound like water. It sounded like every broken promise, every lie, every manipulation that had eroded my life, one drop at a time until I was drowning in their greed. I thought back to the first time he had asked me for money, really asked me. Not the small requests for gas or groceries, but the big one that set the tone for everything that followed. Michael was 25 then, sitting on my old plaid couch, eyes red from crying, smelling of whiskey, holding a folded notice in his trembling hands. It was a traffic court citation. He'd gotten into a fender bender after drinking, nothing life-threatening, but the fine was nearly $15,000, and if he didn't pay it, he'd lose his license. "Mom, if I can't drive, I can't work," he'd said, his voice so desperate, so boyish that my heart cracked. I remember opening the cookie tin in my kitchen where I had been saving up after weeks of double shifts at the diner. $17,000. My hard-earned plan to finally fix the broken furnace so I wouldn't have to sleep through another Massachusetts winter wearing 3 sweaters and a knit cap. But I looked at my son's face. That same face I had kissed goodnight 1,000 times, and I handed it all over. "Don't worry, honey, that's what mothers are for," I said. And he hugged me so tight, I almost believed he meant it. He promised to pay it back within the month, but, of course, that never happened, and I never asked, because I told myself love wasn't a transaction, and a good mother doesn't keep score. That winter, while Michael and Ashley were posting photos of ski trips and fancy dinners, I was sleeping under piles of blankets, watching my breath fog up the air inside my own house. Then came Ashley, breezing into his life like a storm, with a designer purse that cost more than I'd made in 2 weeks, with her perfect nails and her way of saying Helen that sounded more like, "Helen, you're not enough." From the very first dinner, I saw it in her eyes. She didn't see me as family. She saw me as an obstacle. Or worse, an investment. She smiled, complimented my pot roast, called me the sweetest, but her gaze was cold, measuring, like she was appraising me, deciding how much use she could get out of me before she tossed me aside. It wasn't long before the requests started coming in her voice, not his. "Michael wants to take me to the Capitol Grill, Helen. You know, it's where my parents go all the time. I'd hate for him to look cheap." That dinner was $200, money I scraped by eating instant noodles for the rest of the month. Then the engagement ring. She'd seen one at Tiffany's on Fifth Avenue in New York City, $2,500. "I'm not materialistic," she told me one afternoon when we were alone in my kitchen. "But a woman only gets engaged once in her life, right?" So I sold the only real thing of value left from my mother, her string of pearls, the only heirloom that had survived 3 generations of women who worked too hard and got too little. It wasn't enough, so I added the rest for my emergency savings, and when Ashley slipped that ring on her finger and called me the best mother-in-law in the world, I swallowed the bitterness and smiled like I had bought myself a place in their happiness. But it was the wedding that sealed my fate. Ashley wanted something intimate but elegant at a vineyard in Napa Valley. Intimate meant 150 guests, elegant meant imported flowers, a string quartet, a custom gown, and a photographer whose rate for one night was more than I'd made in a year. Michael came to me one night, his face heavy with shame that looked practiced. Mom, Ashley's dad was supposed to cover half, but his business is struggling. If we can't get $30,000, the whole wedding falls apart. She's been crying for days. $30,000. More than 5 years of my life in a lump sum. He asked me to take out a mortgage against my house, the last thing I had left from a lifetime of working, the only security I had for old age. I remember sitting in that bank, signing the papers, the manager, a man who had known me for decades, looking at me with pity. "Helen, are you sure?" he asked softly. I lied and said yes because I told myself this was an investment in my son's happiness, in my future grandchildren, in family. But the truth was, I was gambling with my life for the illusion of love. The wedding was beautiful. Ashley glowing in a dress that cost more than my car, Michael smiling like a man who had it all. Guests congratulated me, told me how proud I must be, but when I looked at the photo albums weeks later, I was in 3 pictures out of 200, and in 2 of them, I was half hidden behind Ashley's glamorous sister. That night, alone in my bed, I realized I had bought my ticket into a life where I was invisible. After the wedding came the monthly mortgage bills. $450, half my Social Security, every month for 10 years. Michael promised to help, but every month brought a new excuse. Ashley lost her job. Ashley needed fertility treatments. Ashley's car broke down. Always something. And every time I thought about pushing back, about saying no, guilt wrapped around my throat like a rope. "Mom, don't you want to see us happy? Don't you want to be a part of our future?" he'd ask, and my heart would crumble. But the breaking point came not from the money, but from the humiliation, the tiny cuts that never healed. Like the Sunday afternoon, I showed up at their new condo in Cambridge with a homemade pound cake, only to be told at the door, "Helen, we're busy right now. Come back later." Busy on a Sunday afternoon in a house bought with my sacrifice? I stood there like a fool on the doorstep, clutching the cake, feeling like an unwanted solicitor instead of a mother. I took it home and ate it alone while old reruns flickered on my TV, wondering when family had turned into a transaction. And still I stayed silent because mothers sacrifice, right? Because I thought if I gave enough, eventually they'd let me in. Eventually I'd matter. But they didn't. Not until that day, standing in my kitchen with my packed suitcase and my new dress, hearing my son laugh as he told me they were already in the Bahamas without me. That was the moment the scales fell out of my eyes. That was the moment I realized I had spent years financing my own erasure. And as I stared at my reflection in the window, at the old woman with hollow eyes, something shifted deep inside me. For the first time in decades, I didn't feel like a mother. I felt like a woman who was done being used. And I promised myself, tomorrow I walk into that bank not as an ATM, not as a victim, but as someone ready to take back her life. The next morning, the sunlight through my thin curtains felt harsher than usual, almost mocking, as if it was reminding me of every morning I had spent rushing to fix my son's problems while ignoring my own. But instead of picking up the phone to call Michael like I had done 100 times before, I just sat at the kitchen table and let the silence stretch, replaying all the little humiliations that had stacked up like bricks in the wall that now separated me from him. And I realized this wasn't new. This had been building for years. I thought back to the Thanksgiving 3 years ago, when I had cooked a turkey with all the trimmings, cranberries, stuffing, pumpkin pie, working for 2 days straight, even though my arthritis screamed with every stir of the spoon, only for Michael and Ashley to show up an hour late, sweep in with a bottle of champagne they hadn't paid for, kiss me on the cheek, and then rush out early because they had real family plans with Ashley's side. I had stood at the sink, scrubbing greasy pans, tears stinging my eyes as the house echoed with emptiness, telling myself it was just a phase, just young people being selfish. But deep down, I knew they had already decided I was a burden they tolerated instead of a mother they cherished. I thought back to the Christmas when they asked me to host, insisted really, and I spent my last $100 on decorations and presents, wrapping little boxes with care, only to find out later they had given Ashley's parents diamond cufflinks and a silk scarf, while mine sat untouched under the tree. They had called me old-fashioned when I cried over it, like my feelings were a punchline. And then there was the time I overheard Ashley at a family barbecue laughing with her friends saying, "Oh, Helen's sweet, but she's basically our sponsor. Michael calls, she pays. It's like clockwork." I remember standing there, paper plate in my hand, potato salad sliding off as the words sliced into me, the laughter around me drowning out the sound of my own heartbreaking. These weren't isolated incidents. They were a pattern, a carefully woven web of exploitation dressed up as love. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized I hadn't just been their safety net, I had been their lifestyle. My sacrifices had funded their dinners at Ruth's, their trips to Miami, their new SUV with leather seats, while I was patching up leaks with duct tape and heating canned soup because the gas bill was too high. And yet, every time I tried to pull back, guilt dragged me under again. "Mom, you don't want us to struggle, do you?" Michael would say. And I'd hand over the last bills in my purse because I couldn't bear the thought of him suffering, even when I was the one barely surviving. But sitting there, with my packed suitcase still by the door like a monument to my naivete, I realized the cruelest part wasn't the money. It was that they had made me feel crazy for wanting to be loved the way I loved them. They had convinced me that my worth was tied to my wallet, that my love was valid only if it came with a wire transfer attached. And when Ashley's voice had cut through the phone line in the Bahamas, dismissing me as someone who didn't belong, it wasn't just exclusion, it was confirmation of the truth I had been too afraid to face. In their eyes, I had never been family. I had been funding. That night, I opened the old fireproof box where I kept my important papers, and for the first time in years, instead of pulling out cash or checkbooks, I pulled out the mortgage documents, the bank statements, every receipt I had saved in hopes that someday Michael might surprise me and say, "Here, Mom, I'm ready to pay you back." I spread them across my kitchen table, my fingers trembling, not with weakness, but with a strange, fierce energy I hadn't felt in decades. The numbers told the story I had been too blind to admit. 3 years, more than $3 million drained away. My retirement gone, my dignity sold off piece by piece. And yet, as I looked at the mess of papers, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Control. Because now I had proof, and with proof came power. I told myself that when the sun rose again, I would walk into that bank not to ask, not to beg, but to draw a line in the sand. And for the first time in years, I fell asleep without the sound of dripping guilt in my ears, but with the steady beat of determination in my chest. The next morning, I put on my old navy blue coat, the one I had worn to Michael's wedding because it was the closest thing I owned to formal, and I walked through the chilly Boston air to the bank on Main Street, clutching my folder of documents like it was armor, my knees aching with every step, but my resolve sharper than it had ever been. And when I pushed through those glass doors, the smell of polished wood and cold metal told me this wasn't just an errand, it was a battlefield. The bank manager, Mr. Lewis, had known me for nearly 20 years. He'd watched me deposit tips from my diner shifts in crumpled dollar bills, had seen me carefully squirrel away savings for emergencies, and his eyes softened when he saw me approach his desk. "Helen, what brings you in today?" he asked, his voice kind, but cautious, like he already suspected the answer. I sat down, laid out the stack of papers, and said, "I need to know exactly how much I've given away these last 3 years." He frowned, tapped on his keyboard, and printed out pages of transaction history that looked like a confession of my own foolishness. Line after line of transfers to Michael's account, withdrawals timed to his calls, mortgage payments I had covered alone while he and Ashley flaunted their vacations online. When he stapled it together and slid it across the desk, the total at the bottom nearly knocked the breath out of me. Over $3 million gone. Almost everything I had scraped and saved from 40 years of work gone to fund the comfort of two people who had left me behind. I gripped the papers until my knuckles turned white, my chest tight, but instead of tears, a hot, righteous fury spread through me, stronger than the coffee that had burned my tongue that morning. Mr. Lewis leaned forward, his voice low. "Helen, you don't have to let this continue. We can set up protections on your account, new authorizations, tighter restrictions, even a fresh account that only you can touch. They can't take from you unless you allow it." For a moment, shame bubbled up in me. Shame at having been so gullible, so blind. But then I thought of Ashley's smirk and Michael's laugh when he said they were already in the Bahamas, and that shame hardened into steel. "Do it," I told him, my voice steady. "Change everything. From now on, no transfer leaves my account unless I'm standing right here to sign it myself." He nodded, and for the first time in years, I felt like someone was on my side. Someone who saw me not as a foolish old woman, but as a client with rights. As I walked home, the papers heavy in my purse, the wind biting at my cheeks, I realized I had been living in a kind of fog, convincing myself that love meant sacrifice, that being a good mother meant emptying myself out. But the fog had lifted, and in its place was a clarity so sharp it hurt. My own son had built a life of luxury out of my bones, and now that I was pulling back, they would do whatever it took to break me into giving again. That night, my phone rang over and over, first Ashley with her honeyed voice, then Michael with his familiar guilt, both of them desperate, demanding to know why the automatic transfer hadn't gone through. I sat in my chair by the window, looking at the leaking roof I had neglected for them, and when I finally answered, I told Ashley the same words she had once flung at me from her beach chair in the Bahamas. "I only do things for the closest people in my life." Then I hung up. The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't heavy with loneliness. It was filled with the sound of chains snapping, one by one, as I finally started to free myself. They didn't wait even a day before turning up the pressure, and by the following afternoon, my phone was buzzing so often, it rattled on the kitchen counter like a wasp trapped in a jar. Ashley sobbing on voicemail about how the landlord was threatening to evict them unless I wired $10,000 immediately. Michael leaving message after message about how I was losing it, how this wasn't like me, how my sudden refusal to help was proof that I wasn't thinking straight. And when I didn't respond, the guilt trip escalated into outright threats. "Mom, if you don't fix this, you're destroying your own family," he snapped in one recording, his voice a sharp edge I'd never heard before. The next morning, the doorbell rang so hard I thought it would crack. And when I peered through the peephole, there was Ashley standing on my porch in her $1,000 coat I had bought last winter, mascara streaking down her cheeks, holding a manila envelope like it was a weapon. "Helen, please, just let me in. We need to talk about the future of our family," she begged, her voice trembling with a desperation I had once believed, but this time I saw it for what it was: theater. I cracked the door, but kept the chain latched. "What's in the envelope?" I asked, my tone colder than I thought I was capable of. She hesitated, then stammered, "It's just some papers. Legal things, nothing you need to worry about. Just sign here and it'll protect you." I demanded to see them, and when she reluctantly held one up to the gap in the door, my blood ran cold. It was a power of attorney, drafted to strip me of my control, to hand them the keys to everything I had left under the guise of help. For years, I had ignored the nagging voice in my head that warned me, but in that moment, it screamed. They weren't content draining me slowly anymore. Now they wanted to legally erase me, to make me a ghost in my own life. "Get off my porch, Ashley," I said firmly, my hand steady on the chain. She tried again, tears and pleading spilling over, but I slammed the door before she could finish, the echo reverberating through my little apartment like the sound of finality. Minutes later, the phone rang again, but this time it wasn't Michael or Ashley. It was a man with a smooth voice introducing himself as Attorney Wallace, claiming to represent my son. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, his words laced with artificial concern, "your children are very worried about your recent erratic decisions. They simply want to ensure your finances are handled responsibly for your own good." For my own good? Those three words nearly made me laugh out loud, because for years, every lie, every theft, every manipulation had been wrapped in that same excuse. I cut him off. "Tell my son, if he's worried about my finances, he can start by paying back a fraction of what he's stolen." His pause on the other end told me everything. They had already discussed painting me as incompetent, unfit, crazy, and he was the tool they'd use to do it. My knees trembled as I hung up, but not from fear, from rage, from the sick realization that my own child was preparing to drag me into court to declare me unfit just so he could keep stealing from me, legally. That night, I sat at my table with a cup of tea gone cold, and I told myself something I should have said years ago. This is not family. This is warfare. And if they wanted a war, I was finally ready to fight back. That evening, as the weight of the lawyer's words still echoed in my ears, I realized I couldn't carry this fight alone anymore. Not against Michael, not against Ashley, and certainly not against their attorney, who clearly had no problem twisting the truth into a noose around my neck. My eyes wandered to the apartment next door, where the faint glow of a television flickered through thin curtains, and I thought of Clara, my neighbor for over 15 years, a retired nurse, widowed like me, who had never once asked me for a dime, but who had checked on me with soup when I was sick, and once shuffled my front walk after a storm without even knocking to say she'd done it. She was the kind of friend you didn't realize you had until the rest of the world turned on you. With trembling fingers, I dialed her number, and when she answered with her warm, steady voice, I felt a crack in the dam I had been holding back for too long. "Clara," I whispered, my throat raw, "I think my son is trying to steal everything I have left." Within minutes, she was standing in my kitchen, her robe pulled tight against the chill, her silver hair frizzed from sleep, but her eyes sharper than any doctor I'd ever met. I told her everything, every transfer, every lie, every humiliation, from the pearls I'd pawned for Ashley's ring, to the mortgage I'd signed for their vineyard wedding, to the way Ashley had stood on my porch hours ago with legal papers designed to strip me bare. Clara listened, scribbling notes in the same deliberate way I'd once seen her mark charts when she worked night shifts at the hospital. When I finished, she set her pen down, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "Helen, this isn't just manipulation. This is elder financial abuse. And if they're trying to prove you incompetent, that's fraud. But you're not alone. Not anymore." Her words wrapped around me, like the blanket I wished Michael had cared enough to buy me during those freezing winters. And for the first time, I felt like I wasn't just whispering my pain into the void. Clara made a call right then, to a friend of hers who worked with senior was fighting exploitation. And within a day, I was sitting in a cramped office, smelling of old books and determination, across from a woman who introduced herself as attorney Margaret Doyle. She was in her 70s, too, her hair pulled back into a no-nonsense bun, her glasses perched low on her nose, and the steel in her voice made me believe she could cut through lies like a surgeon. She listened to my story without flinching, and when I finished, she leaned back, steepled her fingers, and said, "Helen, what your son and daughter-in-law are doing isn't just immoral, it's criminal. We can not only block their attempt to strip you of your rights, but we can go after them for every cent they took. But I need you to be ready. This won't be easy." I swallowed hard, feeling my palms sweat. "What do I have to do?" I asked. "You fight," she replied. "You let me build your case, you gather every scrap of evidence, and when they drag you into that courtroom claiming you're incompetent, you look the judge in the eye and show him you're stronger than ever." That night, I spread out my life on my kitchen table. Bank statements, mortgage records, receipts, even screenshots of Ashley's Instagram posts flaunting vacations I had paid for. And with Clara's help, I began to assemble a timeline of my own exploitation. And with every document I placed into that growing pile, I felt the shame shrink and the rage grow, transforming into something new: resolve. They wanted me weak. They wanted me broken. They wanted me silent. But I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. If they wanted a war, they were about to learn just how dangerous a 72-year-old grandmother could be when she'd had everything stripped away but her will to survive. The days that followed turned my quiet little apartment into something I never thought it would be: a war room. My kitchen table, once the place where Michael used to color as a boy while I made him grilled cheese sandwiches, was now covered edge to edge with folders, bank statements, printouts of text messages, even handwritten notes of every humiliating conversation I could remember. Clara sat with me almost every afternoon, her nursing precision turning my scattered memories into neat timelines, highlighting patterns that made me shiver. Like how Michael always waited exactly 2 weeks after an argument before calling with another emergency, or how Ashley's Instagram posts often coincided with sudden requests for money that supposedly went to rent or medical bills, but in reality funded champagne brunches and beach trips. Attorney Doyle came by twice a week, sharp and focused, her voice like a hammer driving nails into the coffin of their lies. She told me plainly, "Helen, they're not just greedy, they're strategic. They're laying groundwork to paint you as unstable. That's why the lawyer called. That's why Ashley showed up with those papers. That's why the whispers in your neighborhood have already started." And she was right, because within a week, even the corner grocer who had known me for 30 years tilted his head with pity when I came in. "Helen, are you doing okay?" he asked carefully, his eyes darting away. I pressed him, and he admitted Ashley had been in there telling anyone who would listen that I was confused lately, forgetting things, making strange decisions with my money. The humiliation burned. But this time, it didn't make me fold. It made me furious. They were trying to erase me not just from my bank account, but from my own reputation. And so, instead of shrinking, I got louder. I started carrying a small recorder in my cardigan pocket, taping every phone call. I saved every voicemail, especially the ones where Michael's voice dropped into that ugly, unfamiliar tone. "Mom, you're acting crazy. If you don't sign those papers, we'll have no choice but to go to court." Crazy. That word clanged in my ears like a warning bell. For years, they had trained me to believe love was proven by sacrifice. But the second I stopped sacrificing, they declared me insane. I poured it all into my growing pile of evidence, and at night when the loneliness tried to creep back in, I would read through those pages and remind myself, this isn't weakness, this is proof. Meanwhile, Clara kept me grounded. She'd brew chamomile tea and remind me to eat when I got too caught up in my fury to remember meals. "You're not just fighting for you," she said one evening as we sorted receipts. "You're fighting for every older woman who's been treated like a walking wallet." Her words stuck with me, echoing in my head as I brushed my teeth that night, looking at the lines in my face that had been carved by years of exhaustion and sacrifice. For the first time, I didn't just see an old woman, I saw a survivor sharpening her own armor. But just as I started to find my footing, Michael and Ashley raised the stakes. One cold Thursday morning, as I walked back from the post office, I found a woman waiting by my building entrance. She looked polished, mid-40s, with a sleek bob haircut and a folder tucked under her arm. "Mrs. Thompson?" she asks smoothly. "I'm Dr. Wallace, a psychiatrist. Your family's worried about your well-being, and I'd like to speak with you." My blood froze. They had actually sent someone to try to declare me incompetent. I squared my shoulders and said, "I didn't request an evaluation. Please leave." Her smile faltered, but she pressed on. "It's only a conversation, nothing binding, but if you refuse, it will look suspicious." Suspicious? I stared at her, my heart pounding, and realized how far Michael and Ashley were willing to go, parading a stranger to my door to create a paper trail that I was resisting help. But instead of breaking down, I reached into my pocket and clicked my recorder on. "Doctor, do you know my son and daughter-in-law have been trying to force me to sign over my accounts? Do you know they have attempted unauthorized transfers from my bank?" Her eyes flickered, the smooth mask cracking for a split second, and I knew she hadn't expected me to fight back. She muttered something about just doing her job and left in a hurry, but not before I captured every word on tape. That night, I handed the recording to Attorney Doyle, and she smiled grimly. "Perfect," she said. "This proves premeditation. They're not concerned for your health. They're orchestrating a takedown." I went to bed that night trembling, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of knowing I wasn't crazy, I wasn't helpless, and I wasn't alone anymore. I was a 72-year-old grandmother gearing up for the fight of my life, and for the first time in years, I believed I could actually win. The weeks leading up to the hearing felt like walking a tightrope with wolves snapping from below. Every step a mix of fear and fury. But with Clara and the Attorney Doyle by my side, I refused to wobble. We spent hours in Doyle's office, the walls lined with dusty law books and framed certificates, piecing together my case until it read less like a sad old woman's ramblings and more like a weapon sharpened to a point. Every bank transfer had a matching receipt, every Instagram photo had a timestamp, every voicemail was neatly transcribed to show the judge not just the money trail, but the emotional manipulation that bled me dry. Doyle drilled me like a coach before a championship game. "They'll try to rattle you, Helen," she warned, her eyes steady behind her glasses. "Ashley will cry. Michael will guilt you. Their lawyer will paint you as forgetful or fragile. Your job is to stay calm, stay factual, and remember, you are not the one on trial. They are." At night, I would rehearse my answers in front of the bathroom mirror, practicing how to keep my voice steady, how to hold the judge's gaze without letting the tears rise. And in the quiet moments, when doubt whispered that maybe Michael was right, maybe I was crazy for taking my own son to court, I would replay Ashley's voice in my head. "Just the closest family, Michael," as they sipped cocktails in the Bahamas without me, and my spine would stiffen again. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood, as gossip always does, and some people avoided me, whispering that it was so sad Helen lost her mind, while others slipped notes into my mailbox, little scraps of courage. One widow down the block wrote, "They did the same to my sister. Fight for us all." I tucked those notes into my purse like armor. But Michael and Ashley weren't finished trying to break me before the hearing. 2 days before, Michael himself showed up at my door for the first time in months. No phone, no lawyer, just him in a crisp shirt I had once bought him for a job interview, standing on my porch with eyes that tried to mimic the boy I used to know. "Mom," he said softly, almost tenderly, "we don't have to do this. We can fix this quietly. Just sign the papers. No one has to know. I'll make sure you're comfortable for the rest of your life." For a flicker of a second, my heart clenched, wanting to believe. But then I remembered the mortgage, the pawned pearls, the Thanksgiving dinners alone, the laughter at my expense, and I saw the truth in his eyes. This wasn't love. It was desperation dressed up as filial duty. "Michael," I said, my voice trembling but firm, "you stopped being my son the moment you decided money was more important than me." His jaw tightened, his face twisting into something cold and unfamiliar. "Fine. Then I'll let the judge decide how crazy you really are." And with that, he stormed off, his footsteps echoing down my porch steps like the sound of a door slamming shut on the life I once thought I had. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table, my suitcase still by the door from weeks ago, but instead of dread, I felt a strange calm, like the stillness before a storm. Tomorrow, I wasn't just walking into a courtroom. I was walking into the battlefield of my own redemption. The morning of the hearing, I dressed carefully, not in anything new or flashy, but in my best navy dress, the same one I had worn to Michael's graduation decades ago, when I still believed my sacrifices meant something. And as Clara walked with me into the courthouse, her arm steadying mine, I felt every eye turn toward us. Neighbors whispering, Ashley's friends smirking, Michael pacing in his press suit, as though this was all just business as usual. The courtroom smelled of old wood and polished brass, and when the bailiff called my name, I lifted my chin and walked to the front with every ounce of dignity I could muster. Their lawyer, slick-haired and smug, opened with a performance that made my blood boil, painting me as an elderly woman struggling with confusion, claiming Michael and Ashley had been selflessly supporting me through my decline, and that the power of attorney was simply a way to ensure her safety. Ashley dabbed her eyes with a tissue, Michael bowed his head, and for a moment even the judge's brow furrowed with concern. But when it was my turn, Attorney Doyle stood like a blade of steel and began dismantling their lies piece by piece. She played the recordings of Ashley begging me to sign away my rights, of Michael's voice calling me crazy for saying no, of the so-called psychiatrist trying to ambush me on my own doorstep. She displayed the Instagram photos, Ashley with cocktails in Cabo, Michael grinning beside a new car, each dated the same week as their supposed emergencies. She held up my bank statements, line after line, of transfers bleeding my savings dry, and the courtroom grew silent, except for the turning of pages and the occasional gasp from someone in the back row. When it was my turn to speak, I stood slowly, my hands trembling not with fear, but with the weight of years. I looked at the judge, my voice clear, and said, "Your Honor, I may be 72, but I am not confused and I am not incompetent. What I am is a mother who gave everything she had out of love and who was treated like a wallet instead of a human being. I gave them my savings, my security, even my health, and when I finally said no, they called me crazy. If love means control, then this isn't love, it's theft." For a moment, silence filled the room, heavy and sharp. The judge adjusted his glasses, his eyes lingering on me with something that looked almost like respect, then turned to Michael and Ashley with a sternness that made their lawyer shift uncomfortably. "The evidence presented here is clear," he said slowly. "This is not a case of confusion. This is a case of exploitation, and this court does not reward exploitation." Ashley let out a strangled sob, Michael's face twisted in shock, but I stood steady, the papers still clutched in my hand like proof that I wasn't invisible anymore. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a woman who had finally been heard. When the gavel came down and the judge declared me free from their grasp, it was as if the chains of years of guilt and manipulation shattered all at once, and walking out of that courtroom with Clara on one side and Attorney Doyle on the other felt like stepping into a brand new world. The September sun warmer than it had any right to be, as if even the sky knew I had won. Michael and Ashley didn't look at me as we passed them. Ashley crumpled in her designer dress, Michael's jaw tight with the fury of a man who had just lost his favorite toy. But I didn't need their eyes on me anymore. My phone stopped buzzing with their demands, my mailbox no longer filled with veiled threats, and for the first time in decades, I could breathe without the weight of someone else's needs pressing on my chest. I went home to my small house, the one with the leaky faucet and the peeling wallpaper, and instead of seeing problems, I saw possibility. So I called a plumber, a painter, and a cleaning crew, and within weeks, my little home was glowing like it hadn't since my husband was alive. I bought myself new curtains, soft ones that swayed when the window was open, and I stood barefoot in my kitchen on a Sunday morning, sipping coffee from a mug I'd picked out just for me, realizing I didn't owe anyone an explanation for finally living. Clara invited me to a community group for older women who'd been through the same, and when I told my story, I saw heads nodding, tears falling, and hands squeezing mine as if to say, "You spoke for us too." I even began volunteering, sharing my journey with others who felt trapped, showing them that it's never too late to say no, never too late to take back your dignity. One evening, I walked past the mirror, and for the first time in years, I didn't see just a tired old woman with gray hair. I saw a survivor, a fighter, a grandmother who had raised children, buried a husband, been used and discarded, and still stood tall. And in that reflection, I whispered to myself, "Margaret, you're free." I didn't need Michael's approval or Ashley's fake smiles or anyone else's validation. What I needed was already inside me all along. That night, I opened the windows, let the autumn breeze in, and slept deeply, peacefully, without fear of the phone ringing, without shame of the past, knowing that the rest of my years finally belonged to me and me alone.